The wind howled across the barren, dusty plains of the planet, the noise a constant reminder of the desolation that surrounded the small crew. The sky, streaked with blood-red clouds, seemed to stretch endlessly, a symbol of the hopelessness that had settled over the planet, a planet that just weeks ago had been a thriving hub of exploration and discovery. Now, it was nothing more than a forgotten wasteland. In the center of this desolate landscape stood the remains of a massive spacecraft. The ship had once been a symbol of humanity's incredible achievement, an advanced vessel capable of navigating through the harshest of environments. But now it was just another scrap heap, a piece of history left to rot in the harsh atmosphere. The once glorious ship was scarred by the fierce battles that had taken place on this forsaken planet, its hull torn apart by relentless attacks and the ravages of time. Among the wreckage, the small crew of humans stood, their faces weary and their spirits shattered. Mark, the youngest engineer among them, stood at the forefront, staring at the hulking remains of the ship. His mind raced with thoughts of escape, of the future, but the grim reality before him kept pulling him back. Their supplies were running low, and the planet's hostile environment was becoming more dangerous by the day. They had tried everything, every option, every plan, every hope, but there was no way off this planet. The ship was beyond repair, a lost cause. "I told you we couldn't fix it," muttered Sarah, the medic, shaking her head in disbelief. She wiped the sweat from her brow, her eyes full of resignation. "It's over. We're stuck here." The others nodded in agreement. For weeks now they had tried to revive the ship. They had scavenged parts, repaired systems, and hoped against hope that something would work. But with each passing day their chances grew slimmer. The ship was just too far gone. "Maybe it's time to accept the truth," said Thomas, the crew's commander. His voice was low, carrying the weight of 1,000 failures. "We're not going to make it." Mark's heart sank. He knew that the odds were stacked against them. He could see the fear in the eyes of his fellow crew members. They were all thinking the same thing. There was no hope left. They were stranded, and no one would come for them. The planet was too far from any major trade routes, and no one even knew they were here. But as he stared at the broken ship, something deep inside him stirred. Mark wasn't ready to give up, not yet. He had spent his whole life surrounded by technology, understanding its intricacies, solving problems that others deemed unsolvable. The ship may have been broken, but it wasn't beyond salvation. He just needed to find a way. "Wait," he said, his voice cracking through the silence. "I think there's still a chance." The crew turned to him, their faces a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. "Mark," Sarah said cautiously, "we've tried everything. We've checked the engines, the power cores. It's just scrap now." "I know, but..." Mark hesitated, his mind racing. "I've been thinking about this for a while. What if we missed something? What if we're not looking at the ship the right way? There might be one thing we haven't tried yet." The others exchanged skeptical looks, but Mark could see the flicker of hope that had been long extinguished in their eyes. It wasn't much, but it was something. "You're saying we can fix it?" Thomas asked, his voice skeptical but tinged with a hint of curiosity. "I don't know if we can fix it, but I think we can get it working," Mark said, his voice growing more confident. "We might not have all the parts, but there's still enough here to power it up. It's going to be risky, and it's going to take everything we have left, but we can try. We have to." There was a long pause, the wind howling around them, carrying with it the whispers of defeat. But in Mark's eyes, the crew saw something they hadn't seen in weeks, a glimmer of determination, the spark of life that they had all but given up on. Mark turned back to the wreckage, his eyes fixed on the ship's battered hull. Every part of him knew that this was a long shot, that the ship was likely too far gone to save. But what choice did they have? The alternative was certain death, and they weren't ready to give up. Not yet. Not when there was still a chance. The team rallied behind Mark, and together they began to assess the damage once more. With each step, the noise of the wind seemed to fade as the hum of engines, of possibilities, began to fill the air. The crew split into groups, each tackling a different part of the ship. Mark, though, focused on the heart of the ship, the power core. Without it, they wouldn't get anywhere. It was old, rusted, and beyond recognition. But deep down, Mark believed that if there was one chance for escape, it lay within that core. As he worked, a sudden flicker of light came from the ship's broken interface. It wasn't much, just a small spark, but it was enough to make Mark pause. Was it possible? Had he really found something that would work? With shaking hands, he connected the final wire. The team gathered around him, holding their breath as he powered up the system. The air was thick with tension, and then, in an instant, the ship roared to life. The engine coughed, sputtered, and then the power surged. The ship, once abandoned and broken, now hummed with life. The flickering lights blinked brightly. The metallic creaks echoed through the hull, and for the first time in weeks, the crew dared to believe that they might actually make it off this forsaken planet. The ship's low hum filled the air, reverberating through the wreckage like the beating heart of a long-dead creature coming to life. Mark stared at the now glowing power core, his breath caught in his throat. The dull flicker that had sparked to life moments earlier was growing stronger, brighter. It was as though the ship was awakening from a long slumber, the dormant energy, inside it stirring once more. Around him, the crew stood in stunned silence. Sarah, Thomas, and the others had gathered around, their eyes wide with disbelief. It was happening. The impossible was unfolding before them. "Is this real?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Mark, did you really do it?" Mark didn't answer immediately. He was too focused on the ship, watching the lights flicker, the panels beginning to warm with power. But there was still something unsettling about it all. The ship was coming back to life, but it didn't seem like it was doing so willingly. It felt like something else was awakening within it, something that was beyond human understanding. "Mark," Thomas called out, his voice breaking through the trance-like state. "We need to be careful. The ship's old. We don't know what's still functional. We could make things worse." Mark's fingers hovered above the controls. He understood Thomas's concern. They had been working on the ship for hours now, pushing it to its limits, but this was different. The ship had never reacted this way before. Its systems had always been dead, no sign of life. And now the dormant energy within it was boiling over, almost like it had been waiting for something or someone to unlock it. "I know," Mark said quietly, his voice filled with determination. "But it's our only chance. We don't have any other options. This is it." With one final glance at his team, Mark pressed a button on the console. The ship's engines sputtered and groaned, as if protesting the sudden burst of power. The loud creaks of the old hull filled the air, followed by a deep, low rumble. For a split second, everything seemed to pause, the crew holding their collective breath, waiting for the inevitable. Then, suddenly, a flash of light shot through the ship's interior, followed by the deafening roar of the engines firing to life. Mark stumbled backward, his heart racing as the ship shuddered, the floor beneath his feet vibrating. It was like being in the belly of a beast that had just woken from its century-long nap. The hum of the engines grew louder, vibrating through the air as the ship strained against its own broken systems. "Hold on," Mark shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of noise. He had only moments to react. He turned to his crew, his eyes wide with fear and excitement. "Get to the control panels. We need to stabilize the systems before this thing explodes." The team sprang into action, rushing to the various control panels that lined the walls of the ship. The ship's power was surging, too much for the outdated systems to handle. Sparks flew from the wiring, and the sound of metal grinding against metal filled the air. Mark's heart raced as he scrambled to connect the final circuits. His mind was working faster than ever before, calculating the risk, calculating the solution. It was all on him now. "Mark!" Thomas yelled over the chaos, panic creeping into his voice. "We're losing control of the stabilizers. The ship's going to fall apart." The ship groaned again, a sound that seemed to come from deep within its metallic bones. The lights flickered and died, only to blink back on, now dim and unstable. The rumbling continued, louder now, shaking the entire structure. Mark could feel the sweat running down his face as he worked frantically. His hands shook with the pressure of it all, but he kept going, focusing on the task at hand. His crew was counting on him. They had nothing else. They had to make it work. With one last desperate push, Mark pressed a sequence of buttons on the main console. The ship's engines gave a final guttural roar, and then the shaking stopped. The rumbling quieted. The light steadied, casting a steady glow across the room. Mark let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The ship was stabilized. For now. The crew slowly began to relax, their fear replaced by disbelief and relief. It was happening. They were actually going to escape. The ship that had been written off as scrap, the ship that had been left for dead, was now alive. It wasn't perfect. It was a long shot, but it was enough. They had a chance. "Mark," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You did it. You brought it back to life." Mark smiled, though the relief in his chest was tempered by a nagging feeling in the back of his mind. Something was still off. He couldn't shake the sense that the ship had more power than they had unlocked, and the longer they stayed on this planet, the more he realized the ship was alive in ways they couldn't fully understand. There was more to this ship than met the eye, and Mark couldn't help but wonder if it was leading them towards something greater, or something far more dangerous. The moment the ship's engines roared to life, the crew knew they were far from safe. What began as a glimmer of hope had rapidly spiraled into a struggle for survival. The ship, though now functioning, was still an old beast, barely held together by the crew's desperate repairs. Its systems hummed and sputtered unpredictably, and with each passing second, the instability of their situation grew clearer. Mark stood at the control panel, his fingers hovering nervously over the console. The ship had stabilized, yes, but not without consequences. The ship's body was still shaking violently, sending tremors through the hull. Sparks flew from the electrical wiring, and the warning alarms blared incessantly. The outside world, once a silent and deserted wasteland, was now becoming increasingly hostile. "Mark!" Sarah's voice cut through the chaos, her face pale as she ran up to him. "The engines aren't holding. We need to get them under control or we're not going to make it past the atmosphere." Mark swallowed hard, his heart pounding. He could feel the sweat running down his brow as he stared at the malfunctioning systems. The ship's power was surging erratically, causing the engines to flare up and die, creating a cycle of instability. Every flicker of power seemed like a countdown to disaster. "We don't have much time," Mark muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. His hands moved across the controls in a blur, inputting commands to stabilize the power levels. But it wasn't enough. The ship's movements grew more erratic as the damage from years of disrepair began to catch up with them. The crew's earlier excitement faded into fear. The wreckage they had hoped to escape from was now rapidly turning against them. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed throughout the ship. The entire structure shuddered, as though it had been struck by something large and powerful. Mark was thrown off balance, slamming into the control panel. His vision blurred for a moment, and he gasped for breath, disoriented. The others scrambled to their feet. "What the hell was that?" Thomas shouted from across the room, his eyes wide. With panic, Mark's mind raced. The ship had been hit by something. But what? The walls groaned, and the lights flickered ominously, casting eerie shadows in the dim, flickering cabin. He staggered to his feet, pressing his hand to the console to steady himself as he tried to assess the situation. There was no way they could ignore it. The ship was under attack. "Incoming!" a voice shouted from the radar station. Mark turned to the crew, his face a mask of determination. "We need to figure out what's going on now." He raced to the rear of the ship where the radar station flickered with static. As he approached, he saw the source of the alarm, a massive shadow moving fast through the atmosphere. His eyes widened in disbelief. "We're not alone," Mark whispered under his breath. The massive shadow was a fleet of ships, closing in quickly. The hum of their engines could be felt through the ship's walls. "We've got incoming enemies," Thomas said, his voice grim. "They must have detected our launch, or maybe they've been waiting for us all along." The enemy ships, appearing to be large and heavily armed, were descending quickly, already within range. They had no time to waste. The crew had hoped they would escape unnoticed, but now, with their malfunctioning ship and the odds stacked against them, they were facing a full-scale assault. "Mark, we're not ready for this," Sarah said, fear creeping into her voice. "The ship is barely operational. If they attack us, we won't survive." Mark's heart raced. It was true. The ship was a ticking time bomb. The crew had spent so long just trying to get it flying, they hadn't considered the dangers of flying in a hostile atmosphere. And now their only chance of survival was being threatened by enemies they hadn't even known existed. The realization hit Mark hard. They might not make it. "We need to get this ship fully powered and up to speed," Mark said, rallying the crew. "No matter what, we have to try. If we don't fight back, we won't make it. We'll be sitting ducks." Mark's words resonated with the crew, igniting the fire of survival within them. They had come too far to give up now. They would not let this be the end. The ship may have been on the brink of falling apart, but with the small amount of power they had managed to salvage, they would fight. Mark ran back to the main control station, where he quickly began reprogramming the ship's emergency defense systems. The lights flickered once more, and the ship shook again as another wave of enemy ships locked into position. The crew braced themselves as the ship groaned beneath them. Outside, the distant sound of explosions and gunfire echoed. The enemy ships fired first, their heavy weapons tearing into the atmosphere around them, sending shockwaves through the air. Mark's fingers flew over the console, and suddenly, the ship's weapon system powered up. The hum of energy surged as the emergency weapons came online. They weren't as powerful as they should have been, but they would have to do. "Prepare for incoming fire," Mark shouted, his voice filled with urgency. The crew scrambled to their stations, strapping themselves into the seats and preparing for battle. Mark could see the enemy ships getting closer, their weapons primed. The air felt thick with tension. The ship lurched forward as Mark pushed the engines to their limits, trying to break free from the enemy's line of fire. The ship shuddered violently as the blast shield snapped into place, but the hull was holding barely. "We've got this," Mark said under his breath, his heart hammering in his chest. The crew released the safety locks on the weapon systems and opened fire on the incoming ships. The ship rocked with every shot, but they fought back, determined to survive. The sky outside lit up with bursts of gunfire, and explosions erupted in the distance. Mark's hand gripped the control stick as he maneuvered the ship through the chaos. It was a fight for survival, and the crew was giving it everything they had. As the enemy ships closed in, Mark knew this was it, the final stand. It would be either them or the enemy. But no matter the cost, they had to survive. With a roar, the ship's engines powered forward and the crew fought back, hoping against hope that this time they would make it out alive. The ship's hull groaned under the pressure as the battle raged on, its metal frame buckling with each blast from the enemy ships. The alarms blared relentlessly, echoing throughout the cabin as Mark wrestled with the control panel, his hands flying over the buttons and levers. The ship was fighting to stay in the air, each malfunction and explosion pushing it closer to its breaking point. But the crew, battered and weary, wasn't ready to give up, not when escape was so close. "Mark, we need to make a move now," Thomas shouted over the cacophony of alarms and the sounds of the enemy fire ripping through the atmosphere. His voice was strained, the stress of the situation taking its toll on him. Mark glanced up at the radar, his eyes narrowing as he saw the enemy ships closing in for the kill. They were too close, much too close. There was no way they could outrun them, not with the ship in this condition. But there was still one card left to play. He just hoped it would be enough. "We're not running," Mark said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "We're going to fight. One last push. The enemy thinks they've won, but we're not done yet." He slammed his hand down on the control panel, activating the emergency thrusters. The ship jolted forward, the engines roaring to life with a sudden burst of power. The ship lurched violently, throwing everyone against their seats. The impact was brutal, but it gave them the momentum they needed. The enemy ships scattered briefly, surprised by the sudden acceleration. But Mark wasn't fooling himself. This was a desperate move. They couldn't sustain this speed for long. "Status report," Mark barked as he struggled to keep the ship steady. Sarah, who had been monitoring the ship's critical systems, looked up from her station, her face pale but determined. The power's fluctuating. The hull's holding, but just barely. We can't take much more of this. Do what you can, Mark urged. We need to get to those guns. The crew moved quickly, their fear transformed into determination. Sarah worked to stabilize the energy surges as the others armed the ship's remaining weapons. Mark kept his eyes fixed on the radar, watching the enemy ships as they regrouped for another assault. The ship's defensive systems had been reactivated, but they were still too weak to hold off the oncoming attack for long. They had one shot, one chance to make it out of this alive. "Mark," Thomas shouted as he grabbed Mark's shoulder. "We've got incoming. This is it." Mark didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward, pressing the comms button with a steady hand. "This is our only shot. Everyone, brace yourselves. We fight or die." He slammed his hand onto the firing controls. The ship's weapons burst to life with a deafening roar. Mark watched in awe as the turrets unleashed a barrage of fire, the energy beams lighting up the sky with blinding flashes of light. The first wave of enemy ships exploded in a series of spectacular bursts, their bodies disintegrating in the air as the ship's weapons tore them apart. The enemy didn't back down, though. They regrouped quickly, retaliating with renewed force. More enemy ships swarmed toward them, launching missiles and laser fire. The ship rocked violently as the first missile exploded nearby, sending shockwaves through the cabin. The lights flickered, and the hull screamed in protest. But the crew held their ground. "Focus the fire on their lead ship," Mark ordered, his voice cool under pressure. "We need to take out their command vessel." The crew worked in perfect unison, their years of training and experience coming together in a seamless display of precision. Mark's hands danced across the controls, adjusting the targeting system. Sarah's fingers flew over the buttons, rerouting power to the shields and weapons, and Thomas, guiding the ship's movements, expertly dodged incoming fire, while returning fire with unrelenting force. The ship trembled once more as another missile struck the side, but Mark's eyes never wavered. The enemy lead ship was within range now, and they had one final shot to end it. With a deep breath, Mark aimed and fired. The shot was perfect. The lead ship erupted into flames, the shockwave from the explosion rocking the entire battlefield. The remaining enemy ships scattered, their formation broken as they scrambled to regroup. The battle was not over, but the tide had turned. "We've got them on the ropes," Thomas said, his voice full of disbelief. "Keep pushing, we can do this." Mark felt a surge of hope rise within him. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time since they'd been stranded on this forsaken planet, he believed they might actually make it out. But there was no time to celebrate. As the enemy fleet tried to regroup, they launched their final assault, a full-on barrage of missiles and laser beams. "We can't take much more of this," Sarah shouted, her face pale as she watched the damage reports coming in. "The hull is breached. If we don't get out of here soon, we're going to lose everything." Mark knew they didn't have much time. They had used up most of their power reserves just to survive the last round of attacks, but he wasn't ready to give up, not when they were so close. He quickly assessed the situation. The remaining enemy ships were closing in fast and their weapons were fully charged, but there was one more option, one final move they could make. It would be risky, but it was the only chance they had left. "Hold on," Mark shouted as he initiated the final sequence. The ship's emergency jump engines were ready. They had only enough power for one final leap, one last jump to safety. But it had to be perfect. One wrong move and they would end up back in the middle of enemy fire, stranded in space. The ship's engines powered up with a low hum, and the crew held their breath as Mark's fingers flew across the console. With a final burst of energy, the ship leapt into hyperspace, the stars stretching into brilliant streaks of light as they vanished from the battlefield. The crew sat in stunned silence as the ship's jump completed. For a moment, there was nothing but the hum of the engines, the sound of their own breaths in the stillness of space. "We did it," Sarah whispered, tears of relief filling her eyes. Mark leaned back in his seat, his body exhausted but his spirit soaring. They had made it. Against all odds, they had survived. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in what felt like forever, they had hope.